Imagine you found a spare room in your apartment and turned it into $1,000 a month. That was the promise. That was the dream. But somewhere between that dream and today, something went very wrong. And the people paying the price are not the ones you would expect. Because Airbnb didn't just disrupt the hotel industry, it disrupted your ability to find a home. In 2008, two broke designers in San Francisco couldn't pay their rent, so they bought 3 air mattresses, threw them on their apartment floor, and charged strangers $80 a night to sleep on them. That company is now worth over $75 billion. It has more listings than the 5 largest hotel chains combined. And in city after city, economists, housing researchers, and ordinary people are asking the same question. Did Airbnb make the housing crisis worse? The answer is more complicated than Airbnb wants you to believe, and far more damaging. Brian Chesky and Joe Gebbia came up with the idea out of desperation. A design conference was coming to San Francisco. Hotels were full. They had floor space. The math was simple. They set up a basic website called Airbed and Breakfast, found 3 guests, and made $1,000 in a weekend. They didn't think it was a business. They thought it was a clever hack to cover rent. But Paul Graham thought differently. Graham, the co-founder of startup accelerator Y Combinator, is famous for funding companies that look ridiculous until they aren't. When Chesky and Gebbia walked into his office, he thought the idea was strange. He funded them anyway. That $20,000 check was the beginning of one of the most transformative and most contested companies ever built. The early days were messy. Growth was painfully slow. The founders famously sold novelty breakfast cereal boxes, Obama O's and Captain McCain's, just to keep the lights on during the 2008 election. Then they cracked the code. They realized that professional photography made listings dramatically more attractive, so they hired photographers to shoot hosts' homes themselves. Bookings doubled almost immediately. Word spread, the product improved, and from there, Airbnb's ascent was staggering. By 2011, the platform had more than 1 million nights booked. By 2014, it was operating in 190 countries. Cities that had never heard of it were suddenly full of tourists sleeping in locals' living rooms, on boats, in tree houses, in repurposed shipping containers. Airbnb had turned the entire world into a hotel, and the world loved it. But here's where the story shifts. Because while Airbnb was growing, something else was growing too. The number of long-term rental apartments quietly disappearing from city housing markets. And, for years, almost nobody noticed. Nobody was looking. Kyle Barron, a researcher who studied Airbnb's economic impact alongside colleagues at the National Bureau of Economic Research, published findings that would make city planners deeply uncomfortable. His work found that every 10% increase in Airbnb listings in a neighborhood corresponded to a measurable rise in rental prices, not a catastrophic jump on paper. But in cities where housing supply is already razor thin, even a small upward push on rents can price out thousands of people. And Airbnb was pushing in hundreds of thousands of neighborhoods at once. Think about what actually happens when a landlord discovers Airbnb. You own a 2-bedroom apartment. A long-term tenant pays you $1,500 a month. Stable, predictable, but not exciting. Then you do the math. At $120 a night, you only need to fill it 13 nights a month to match what your tenant pays. Fill it 20 nights, and you've nearly doubled your income. The tenant gets a notice to vacate. The apartment gets a fresh set of towels and a ring light for the photos. And one more unit disappears from the long-term rental market forever. Multiply that decision by hundreds of thousands of landlords across hundreds of cities, and you start to understand the scale of the problem. David Wachsmuth, a professor at McGill University and one of the world's leading researchers on short-term rental impacts, has spent years mapping exactly this pattern. His team's analysis found that in cities like New York, Los Angeles, and Toronto, Airbnb had removed tens of thousands of units from long-term housing stock. In New York alone, his research estimated that Airbnb activity was responsible for raising average rents by hundreds of dollars a year. for people who were already stretched thin, that was not an inconvenience. That was the difference between staying in a neighborhood and being forced out of it entirely. Airbnb pushed back hard on findings like these. The company argued that the vast majority of its hosts were ordinary people renting out their spare room while they were at work or away for the weekend. The image they carefully cultivated was of a retired teacher making a little extra income, a young couple supplementing their mortgage, everyday people, not corporations. And to be fair, many of Airbnb's hosts really are exactly that. But the data told a very different story underneath. A significant portion of Airbnb's revenue, some studies suggested the majority in major cities, came not from occasional hosts, but from what researchers began calling commercial operators. These were individuals or companies managing multiple full properties, full-time, with no intention of ever sleeping there themselves. In some cities, a tiny fraction of hosts controlled the overwhelming majority of total listings. Someone managing 15 apartments on Airbnb is not a friendly neighbor sharing a spare room. They are running a hotel that discovered a legal gray zone between hospitality and housing, and moved into that gray zone with extraordinary speed and very little resistance. And the cities had no idea what hit them. Barcelona, Amsterdam, New York, Berlin, London. One by one, city officials woke up to the same problem. Entire apartment buildings quietly converted into de facto hotels. Residential neighborhoods filling up with rolling suitcases and strangers who arrived on Friday and were gone by Sunday. Local shops losing their regular customers. Schools losing enrollment. Communities hollowing out from the inside while the Airbnb algorithm showed 5-star reviews and availability in seconds. The backlash was fierce. Amsterdam banned Airbnb rentals beyond 30 nights per year. Barcelona fined Airbnb 17 million euros for listing unlicensed properties and vowed to remove tourist apartments from the city center entirely. New York passed Local Law 18, one of the strictest short-term rental regulations in the world, requiring hosts to register with the city and to be physically present during any guest's stay. The result was dramatic. Thousands of listings vanished almost overnight. Hotel prices in New York shot up. Housing advocates said it was long overdue. Airbnb's response to every new regulation was consistent and carefully managed. The company positioned itself as a champion of the small host. Every restriction, every new law, they framed not as a check on a $75 billion corporation, but as an attack on ordinary people trying to make ends meet. It was brilliant political messaging, because it was partly true, which made it very difficult to argue against without sounding like you were punishing someone's grandmother. But here is what that framing always left out. When New York enforced its new rules, the hosts who disappeared from the platform were not mostly retired school teachers renting a spare bedroom. Analysis published after Local Law 18 took effect found that the vast majority of listings removed were entire apartments, not spare rooms in someone's primary home. The commercial operators, the ones Airbnb had always claimed barely existed, were the ones most affected. The image and the reality were not the same thing. There is something almost elegant about the central contradiction at Airbnb's core. The company was founded on belonging. Their slogan, "Belong Anywhere," became one of the most recognized taglines in modern marketing. Chesky has spoken publicly about wanting Airbnb to make the world feel smaller, warmer, more human. In the early years, there was something genuinely beautiful about the idea. Strangers opening their homes to strangers. A global network built on trust, not transactions. But belonging anywhere, it turned out, came with a cost, and that cost was belonging somewhere. Because when short-term rental income pulls apartments out of long-term housing markets, the people displaced are not tourists with backup plans. They are nurses who grew up in the neighborhood, teachers who need to live near the school where they work, young people who cannot afford to move further out and are now being asked to move further out anyway. People for whom a few $100s extra in monthly rent is not an inconvenience. It is an eviction notice waiting to happen. Jamila Jefferson-Jones, a law professor who has written extensively on housing equity and the platform economy, has argued that the communities most severely affected by Airbnb's expansion were frequently communities of color. In cities like New Orleans and Los Angeles, short-term rental growth was heavily concentrated in historically underserved neighborhoods, areas already under pressure from gentrification, already dealing with decades of disinvestment, already fighting to stay intact. Airbnb didn't create those conditions, but it accelerated them at a pace that gave communities almost no time to respond and gave regulators almost no framework to work with. Airbnb went public in December 2020. The IPO was one of the largest in American history. The stock doubled on its first day of trading, giving the company a valuation that briefly exceeded $86 billion. The Air mattresses were a very long way away, and the timing of that IPO was remarkable for a different reason. It came in the middle of a global pandemic. Hotels were empty, travel had nearly stopped. Airbnb had been on the edge of bankruptcy just months earlier, cutting a quarter of its workforce in a single day and scrambling for emergency financing. And yet, when travel returned, Airbnb didn't just recover, it exploded. Because the millions of people who discovered they could work from anywhere decided that anywhere was more interesting than their apartment, they rented Airbnbs in mountain towns for a month, then 3 months, then 6. That shift, from short weekend stays to extended remote work bookings, quietly changed the geography of the problem. It was no longer just apartments in tourist hotspots. It was houses in small coastal towns, in sleepy mountain villages, in places that had never experienced housing pressure before, where a sudden wave of high-earning remote workers arriving with laptops and long leases sent local rents soaring in a matter of weeks. The schoolteacher's quiet town had become the overflow hotel for the city an hour away. There is one detail from the very beginning of this story that is worth returning to now. Brian Chesky and Joe Gebbia started Airbnb because they couldn't pay their rent. Two young men in a city with a brutal, unforgiving housing market, doing whatever they had to do to survive the month. And from that act of pure financial desperation, they built a company that now, in city after city, stands as one of the forces making rent harder to pay. For people in exactly the position they once occupied. That is not a simple irony. It is not a villain's origin story. It is something more uncomfortable than either of those things. Because Airbnb didn't set out to break the housing market any more than the landlord who evicted a long-term tenant set out to hurt a family. Both were simply following the incentives available to them. Both were solving their own immediate problem. The difference is that Airbnb's solution scaled to 220 countries, and the problem it created scaled with it. Somewhere tonight, in a city you know, a family is sitting in an apartment they can no longer afford, in a neighborhood that used to feel like theirs, wondering what changed. The answer is not simple, but part of it is a website founded by two men who couldn't pay their rent, and who solved that problem so completely that millions of other people now cannot either. That was the dream. And that is exactly where it ended up.